My cousin Pete used to live at my house when I was a kid. His old man used to knock him around, so when my parents stepped in, he got to live at my place, where it was safe. Pete lived with us for several years. I was 16 when he convinced my parents to let me spend 2 nights in the bush with him. Pete was 21 at the time, and he had this project in mind for one of his college art classes. He wanted to build a sculpture using only materials collected from the bush. He was a bit of a hippie, so it made sense that he would want to make something out of nature. He carefully planned out a remote spot in the bush to set up camp and extract his materials. We packed our camping stuff, and we were on the road by Friday afternoon. "This is it," Pete said, as we approached a muddy-looking turnout on a bushy road. "Are you sure?" I asked him, scoping out the dense trees just off the road. "How can you tell?" He got out of the car and opened the trunk. "We're going to have to hike in," he said casually. He'd somehow neglected to mention this on the 4-hour drive here. I was particularly surprised when he told me we'd have to hike about 5 kilometers into the bush. Anyway, we grabbed our gear and ventured off in. The hike was absolutely gorgeous. The ground was mostly flat, aside from some fallen branches and foliage. We crested a hill, and we were greeted by a smooth and quiet billabong, maybe a half kilometer across. It was breathtaking. We found a bit of a clearing pretty close to the water and set up base camp. After our tents were set up, Pete asked me if I wanted to go out and explore. I wholeheartedly accepted. We started out along the edge of the billabong. Within an hour, Pete had found some eagle feathers, a discarded snakeskin, a crocodile tooth, so he claims, and what we thought was petrified wood. We were off to a good start. Pretty soon, we stumbled upon a path snaking off into a denser section of the bush. We followed the path out into a thickly wooded area. The canopy was so tightly packed, light could barely penetrate. It was nearly dark, despite it being late afternoon in the summertime. We reached a clearing where the trees were not so dense, and there was a bright patch where beams of sunlight pierced the canopy. There, half buried in leafy plants, was a pig skeleton. There was an eerie silence as we stood over it for a few moments, staring at the heap of bones resting in the afternoon sun. Pete then bent over and grabbed onto it with both hands. With a twist and a pull, he snapped the skull off the carcass. "Perfect," he said proudly. That evening, we hung around the campsite. As I prepped dinner, Pete took inventory of his collected materials. After we ate, we shared a flask of whiskey Pete brought along, and we watched the sun slide behind the trees. We sat by the fire that night, reminiscing about random stuff, telling each other stories. Pete even played his violin for a while, and I listened to the music echoing through the bush. I woke up the next morning to the sound of the zipper on my tent. I sat up, and I saw Pete standing in the entrance of my tent. He came into the tent and sat down next to me. "Today will be different," he said in a monotone voice. He had this distant look on his face. Pete immediately wanted to go out and explore. I managed to get up and tag along, even though I was tired and the sun was only just beginning to come up. Pete led the way, this time in the opposite direction of the path we had taken the day before. Pete didn't speak at all, not for the entire walk. We followed the billabong around for nearly an hour before Pete suddenly stopped, looked around, then darted into the bush. It was so sudden, I almost lost him. I had no idea he could move that fast. I yelled out to him to slow down, but he was bounding like a kangaroo through the trees. At one point, he disappeared over a hump in the ground. When I finally caught up, he was standing there with his back to me, his head pointed straight down. At his feet was a pile of unidentifiable animal bones. Pete was holding a jawbone. He rolled it around in his hands thoughtfully. "Hey, Pete," I said, through panting breaths. "What are you doing, man? I almost lost you." And then, without warning, he dropped the bone and headed back in the direction of the billabong. I followed him there, leaving the bones behind. He sat down on a big rock and he stared out across the water. Something about his facial expression was wrong. It's like his eyes and his mouth belonged to different people, like they couldn't sync up. After a few minutes, he began describing what he saw in great detail. "I can see colors that you couldn't possibly understand," he said, squinting. "The bush is part of me. It's an extension of my body." Pete went on talking, and he wasn't making much sense. I sat there next to him, honestly not knowing what to do next. I was terrified, but concerned for his well-being. His posture got more and more relaxed until he was literally laying down on the ground next to the billabong, staring up at the sky. A strange, glazed look in his eyes. We sat there for about an hour before I decided I needed to walk around. I figured Pete wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Our immediate position was flanked by a steep incline that rose maybe 20 to 30 feet to a rocky cliff. I looked around to see if there was a way up. It would make a good vantage point to look out over the water. I walked around the edge of the rocky outcropping and found a path. When I got to the top, I could see the surrounding area pretty well. I could see the campsite, but it was easily half a kilometer away on the other side of the billabong. And then I saw it. Someone standing next to my tent. We hadn't seen a soul since we arrived the previous day. The weird thing is, whoever was in the campsite, he just stood motionless next to my tent, arms at his side. I couldn't tell for sure, but it seemed like the person was facing me, staring at me. Then I saw it. The person was holding the skull, the one from yesterday. It occurred to me that he looked a lot like my cousin. I knew this to be impossible. The campsite was probably 20 minutes walk from there. I ran back down the path to tell Pete. But when I arrived, Pete was gone. I called his name loudly and searched the area. I ran back to where the bone pile was, and now the bones were scattered all over the place, like someone had thrown them around in a rage. It took me about a half hour to get back to camp. When I arrived, to my horror, all of my cousin's things were gone. His tent, his violin, the skull, everything. My stuff was still there, untouched. I screamed for my cousin to come back until I was hoarse in the throat, but I received no reply. It was getting dark now. I didn't have a choice but to stay put for the night. I built a fire and I sat next to it by myself. Part of me kept on hoping Pete would wander back to camp, but I knew that wasn't going to happen. After a while of staring out into the darkness, I decided to just post up inside my tent. It was too frightening outside, sitting alone in that sea of darkness. Laying on my back, I listened carefully to every sound in the bush. I hoped that daylight would come quickly. Then, I heard it. A voice, off in the woods somewhere, yelling, "Hey!" It sounded distant, but obviously shouted loudly. I held my breath and I strained my ears. A strong wind howled through the bush. After a few long minutes passed, I was almost ready to dismiss it as my imagination. Then I heard it again, and this time, it was closer. "Hey!" It echoed through the trees. I felt it had to be no more than a few 100 meters away. Waves of panic and fear swept over me. I was trapped in my tent, not sure what to do, just listening. After another few excruciatingly long minutes passed, the voice, now much closer, shouted, "Hey!" It was as if he was right outside the campsite. It was loud this time, and it could have only been directed at me. I curled up inside my sleeping bag, trembling, listening for the footsteps that would inevitably enter the camp. I held my breath for what felt like hours. But the footsteps never came. I tried and tried to build up the courage to look outside of my tent. After what seemed like an eternity, I inched over to the entrance of my tent and slowly pulled the zipper open just by an inch, and I peeked through the hole. My eyes were adjusted to the darkness somewhat. I could see the gently glowing coals in the fire pit. My vision bounced from one tree to another, frantically searching for any foreign shapes. There was nothing unusual out there. Then the wind picked up again, stronger than ever. The breeze rushed through the camp, kicking up leaves along with it, throwing them into the air. Trees swayed back and forth, and smoke swirled from the smouldering fire pit. Everything was moving and dancing in the wind, except one thing. The shape of a man off to the side of the camp. He stood stationary, arms at his side. He was just the shadow shape of a person. I swear, in the shadow, I could see his wild eyes, opened as wide as they could go. I saw him. I fell back into the tent with a thud and again wrapped myself in the sleeping bag. Silently, I prayed for daylight. I shook and I trembled, and after some time, the wind finally died down. When I started hearing birds, I figured it was going to be light soon. Hesitantly, I got out my stuff and started packing. As the light started to filter through the tops of the trees, and I was able to see a little, I noticed some unusual white scraps on the ground, all around the campsite. Picking up one of the scraps, I realized with a wave of sickening fear that they were bones. I ran all the way back to the main road in near darkness. I tripped and fell more than once, scraping my arms and legs. When I got there, of course, my cousin's car was gone. After several hours walking down the road, a car finally appeared. I flagged it down and I got a ride into the nearest town. The town was quiet and didn't have a lot of people around. I did manage to locate a phone booth though. Thankfully, I carried a small pouch of coins for this exact reason. I sank a few into the phone's coin slot. Someone picked up the phone at my parents' house. A familiar voice. It was Pete.
"Oh my God, are you okay? Where are you?"
He asked me, sounding concerned. "I can't believe you left me alone," I said, my voice breaking as I cried into the phone. After some strange confusion on his part, I explained to Pete what had happened. There was a very long pause on the other end, and finally, Pete said slowly,
"We were supposed to go camping next week. Whoever you were with, that was not me."